Well, hello there. This month, the fine folk over on Patreon asked, among other things, who had the best torpedoes in World War II? And since we've already done a anti-aircraft gun comparison and a surface gun comparison, I thought, okay, well, let's do a torpedo comparison as well. Now, with this, there are a few different categories, much like with the anti-aircraft gun comparison where we looked at light, medium, and heavy. It's obviously unfair to compare, let's say, a Japanese Long Lance, which is a 24-inch heavy torpedo, with a dinky little 18-inch air-launched torpedo. So, we have 4 broad categories, and one of them has a slight subcategory element to it. So the smallest category is what I've dubbed heavy torpedoes, that is torpedoes used in World War II with a diameter greater than 21 inches. Then you have electric torpedoes, because of course electric torpedoes have very different characteristics at that time, and perhaps still now, to torpedoes that use more conventional fuel. We then have the 21-inch torpedo, so that is the standard heavyweight torpedo fired by destroyers and submarines and so forth. And then finally, we have a category for lightweight torpedoes. Now, the vast majority of them are 18-inch torpedoes or thereabouts. So when you come to size measurements, it's either 18, 21 or 24 inches, plus or minus a little bit, because of course some people used metric. But in this category, we have essentially air-launched torpedoes, which means the slightly oversized US Mark 13 gets involved in the discussion. But we also have a subcategory in here because there were 4 models of 18-inch surface-launched torpedo. And because of the slight differences in surface versus air-launched torpedoes in terms of design, like the fact that obviously with a surface-launched torpedo you can make it considerably longer and heavier than an air-launched torpedo in general, at least, because you don't have to worry about carting it through the air, I put those 4 in their own little subcategory. So we're going to look at pretty much all of them. The scoring system is a little bit simpler than it is with the guns that we've looked at previously, simply because there isn't things like an elevation rate and so forth for a torpedo. So instead, we are scoring the torpedoes based on the following. What their charge weight is, because, lots of explosive, bigger hole in ship, but also what that charge is equivalent to in TNT. Now, for some torpedoes, that's just the same number because their warhead is TNT, but various torpedoes have different types of explosives in them. The Japanese have an explosive generally in most of their torpedoes called Type 97. The Germans use various mixtures which include hexanite. Let me tell you, figuring out an average TNT equivalent for that was a bit difficult because they use multiple different mixtures with multiple different TNT equivalent rates, so I've ended up using the one that was the most commonly used. And then, of course, you have the ever so wonderful Torpex, which is considerably more powerful than TNT. So, obviously, to a certain degree, someone's managed to fit an amount of explosive in a torpedo that deserves scoring, but if somebody's managed to fit, say, a 600-pound TNT warhead and someone else has fitted a 500-pound Torpex warhead, well, the Torpex warhead is actually more powerful, even though it weighs less, so that also needs to be scored. Then we have their speed at their slowest setting and their corresponding range, if indeed they have such a setting, and then their speed at their fastest setting and the corresponding range, and obviously they have to also have a fast setting to score on that. Almost all torpedoes will have a fast setting. A lot of the air-launched ones don't have a slow setting. And the reason I say almost all have a fast setting is because, let's be honest, the electric torpedoes are not particularly quick. And in each of those categories, each torpedo gets a score of between 0 and 10, where 0 is the torpedo with the least amount in that category, and 10 is the one with the most. So the one with the slowest speed in the fast speed setting would obviously get 0. The one with the highest speed would get 10. and everything in between, and I've rounded it to single decimal places. I did consider adding a category of explosive per weight to reflect the efficiency of packing explosives into a torpedo. However, I decided to discard that largely on the grounds that it could unfairly bias the results towards torpedoes that might therefore have a really, really high score, but weren't actually all that effective. For example, the Kai-10 suicide torpedoes carried a very large amount of explosive, but turned out to be very impractical weapons. Or you could have a hypothetical torpedo that carries an awful lot of explosive, but only goes about 50 feet, but would still score 10 out of 10 because it's 80% explosive in that category. So I left that one out. Other scores that you could add to this to finesse the results some more would be things like reliability, or a variety of homing methods or detonation methods, things like that. But I ended up not doing that on a couple of grounds. Firstly, some things like reliability are a little bit subjective, looking at you Mark 14 and Mark 18, but also an awful lot of them, even if you can come up with an objective way of scoring them, vary quite considerably during that torpedo's lifetime. So, for example, if you were to look at the 1942 Mark 14, it would score terribly on reliability, whereas if you looked at the 1945 Mark 14, it would score quite well on reliability. At which point, do you give it an average and just say it's okay? Do you take the 1942 variant, which is unfair to the 1945 torpedoes? Do you take the 1945 torpedoes, which is hilariously unfair to everyone else because of the terrible reliability at in 1942? Do you create 3 or 4 different entries for the Mark 14 based on which year it's in, and bearing in mind some of these torpedoes switch from TNT to Torpex or TNT to some other explosive equivalent midway down the line, so you have to create separate categories for those anyway, at which point everything gets ridiculously complex, and therefore, again, I decided not to do it because this is a relatively simple analysis. And it also brings up a couple of interesting points because, as you'll see, there are a few torpedoes that on a purely technical basis score very highly, but when you consider them in overall performance terms, also which ones we use the most, you might think, well, maybe 1 or 2 other torpedoes should be bumped up a rank or 2. And obviously that in and of itself, while you're going through this video, is quite an interesting case study in the difficulties of creating properly accurate ranking systems for these kinds of weapon systems, because ultimately, if you go too simplistic, you end up with weird outliers, and if you go overly detailed, you open yourself up to an awful lot of subjective bias. So it'd be interesting to see what you think of this list, and also what factors you think could be relatively objectively scored to improve the list if you don't think it's necessarily 100% on the ball. Now, with that said, we're going to start off with the torpedoes that have the least number of entries and move our way on to the ones with the most entries. Oh, and just before we begin, one quick note: you may notice that a tiny handful of World War II era torpedoes are missing, and that's because they're what I've dubbed highly specialist torpedoes that don't really fit into this kind of comparison ranking. So, for example, there's an absolutely tiny, lightweight air-dropped Italian torpedo whose main purpose was to go circling around in convoys and cause havoc. It's an extremely interesting concept, and weird torpedoes probably deserve a video of their own at some point, but at the end of the day, it's this tiny, tiny lightweight thing, so therefore it cannot carry a particularly large explosive charge, it can't go particularly fast, and it can't go particularly far, so it would automatically rank as pretty much the worst air-dropped torpedo of all time. But that's when you're comparing it with full-sized air-dropped torpedoes, which have a more conventional fly towards target, drop torpedo, pointing towards target, hope it runs true at a distance and blows things up, which is a completely different use case to the Italian torpedo, which was supposed to be parachuted into the middle of a bunch of ships. And therefore, as a completely unfair comparison, because I said different use cases, I've excluded it from the list, and because it's pretty much a unique weapon, therefore, obviously, it doesn't get included. So if there are 1 or 2 odd ones that you think I've left out, that's probably why. Anyway, first we have the heavy category. So this is torpedoes with a diameter substantially greater than 21 inches, and in this entry, we only actually have 4 torpedoes, 2 of which are variants on the same theme. And again, you'll notice 1 or 2 variants have been left out because one of the categorizations for best torpedo of World War II essentially has to be torpedo actually used in World War II. So torpedoes from the 1910s that aren't in use in the Second World War don't get included, but also variants that are perhaps created in 1945 and only really see experimental testing or post-war deployment also don't count because they're not torpedoes of World War II. So in last place is the British 24.5-inch Mark I as found on the battleships Nelson and Rodney. And it's not necessarily all that surprising. It's the lightest of the torpedoes in this category, albeit only by a handful of pounds in the case of entry number 3. But it's also by far the oldest. Its in-service date being 1925, whereas the others start coming into service in the mid-1930s and thereafter. The third place entry is the Japanese Type 90, and then the top 2 places are unsurprisingly taken up by the Japanese Long Lance, the Type 93, in its Model 1 and Model 3 forms. And they lead the field by, let's just say, quite the considerable margin. Now, that's not to say that the British torpedo is bad. It's got a 20,000-yard range at 30 knots and a 15,000-yard range at 35 knots, which compared to pretty much any 21-inch torpedo is absolutely monstrous. It also carries a very large warhead, 743 pounds of TNT, which is enough to overwhelm the torpedo defences of most World War II era capital ships, although some are rated for slightly more than that. But it is massively superseded by the others. Now, interestingly, the Type 90 has a slightly larger warhead. It's 827 pounds, but being Type 97 explosive, it's actually equivalent to about 885 pounds of TNT. Its slow speed setting, 35 knots, 15,000 yards, is actually pretty much identical to the British torpedo, and although it can only travel about 7,500 or just over yards at its fast speed setting is 46 knots. And then you have the 2 Long Lance variants. They are substantially heavier, and the Model 3 considerably so. They have much, much larger warheads, about 1,060 and then 1,720 pounds in the Model 3. And of course, that gets bumped up slightly for them being Type 97 explosive. They both have a default slow speed setting of 37 knots, which is a couple of knots faster, and of course can go massively further on that. The original flavour Long Lance capable of almost 44,000 yards in theory, and the Model 3 of just under 33,000, and they can both travel at 49 knots or possibly more at high speed. But the interesting thing is that the original flavour Long Lance can actually go further, just under 22,000 yards. The Model 3 can only do about 16,500 yards, but of course carries about 2/3 again more explosive. Now, as we go through the categories that have considerably more entries, I'm not necessarily going to go through every single torpedo because we could be here all week. But if you want to see exactly which torpedoes are included and what the breakdown is, it's actually, well, you can either look on the screen or there is now an article on the website which has the spreadsheets and possibly some other data if I choose to throw that in as well. So we move on to the electric torpedoes. Now, the interesting thing is when you say electric torpedo in a World War II context, almost everybody thinks of the G7E, the German electric torpedo, which, to be fair, some people did copy. But you might be surprised to find that in terms of conventionally launched electric torpedoes, almost everybody had one. The US had one, the British had one, the Germans obviously had lots, the Japanese had one, and so did the Soviets. But out of the 11 different torpedoes, or in some cases torpedo variants, that you will find being commonly used, or at least to a certain degree commonly used in World War II, the Germans are in the weird position of, spoiler alert, occupying the bottom 5 and the top places. So how does that work then, Drac? Well, the G7E variants T5, T11, T4, T10, and T5A and B are all in the bottom 5, almost all of them scoring actually less than 5 out of 10, with the T5A and B model scoring 5.4 out of 10. And that's not necessarily because of any particular deficit in range and speed. In fact, the T10 has the highest slow speed, joint highest slow speed, at 30 knots, and the T5A and B has the highest range at 8,750 yards. What's letting them all down is their warhead. All of those torpedo variants are carrying a 440-pound charge, which, using the most commonly used German explosive mixture, seems to be equivalent to about 484 pounds of TNT, because it's a hexanite and other explosives mixture, which, honestly, against any kind of modern torpedo defense system, really isn't going to cut it. Now, to be fair, one of the reasons these torpedoes are quite effective in reality is that they are not used, for the most part, against ships that have torpedo defense systems. They're used against merchant ships and small escorts, which can't have them. But in an objective scenario of we're shooting this potentially at even a capital ship, that is really what's let all those models down. Then we have the US Mark 18, which carries actually the single largest charge once you take into account the TNT equivalent, because it doesn't carry the single heaviest charge, period. In terms of weight, it's a 600-pound warhead, but being Torpex, that's equivalent to 900 pounds, which is enough to overcome almost any torpedo defense system out there, at least again on paper. And it's a relatively swift torpedo at 29 knots, but also a very short range torpedo. In fact, the shortest range of all the electric torpedoes are only 4,000 yards. And then we have the German G7E T2 early model, which has the joint highest top speed at 30 knots, but again a relatively disappointing range of just under 5,500 yards. And although it's got a TNT equivalent warhead of about 675 pounds, which is okay, it's still towards the lower end of the ones that are scoring higher. Then we have the British Mark 11, which is a late entry into the war, only introduced in 1944, but it carries a 710-pound TNT warhead, which actually makes it in the top 3 for explosive power, and it's just using pure vanilla TNT. And it's got a relatively decent range of around 5,500 yards, so it scores 6.5 out of 10. Then we have the Russian electric torpedo, the ET-80, introduced in 1942. It's scoring 7.5 out of 10, although it has the second lowest operational range. It has a 29-knot top speed, so only 1 knot off of being one of the fastest ones. And part of the reason it probably has that short range is because it's absolutely packed with TNT, 882 pounds of it, which gives it the second most effective warhead in this entire category, and the heaviest actual warhead of any torpedo. It's only just pipped to the post for the top spot by the US Mark 18 because of the use of Torpex, and those therefore high marks in both charge equivalent in TNT, and speed, offset to a certain degree the fact that it's actually a fairly short range weapon. In second place, we have the Japanese Type 92 electric torpedo, which, using Type 97 explosive, has a decent sized warhead, just under 710 pounds of TNT equivalent at 29 knots. It's also quite a bit faster than a lot of the German G7E variants, and it's in the top tier with ranges. It's got the third longest range at just over 7,600 yards, which is pretty good for an electric type. But the overall winner is the late variant of the German G7E T2 torpedo. Although its warhead is similar to the early model of the T2, because obviously they're the same torpedo, only equivalent to about 675 pounds, which, as we said, is not going to trouble the better capital ships of World War II. It does have a 30-knot top speed, and at 8,200 yards, it has one of the best ranges, in fact only pipped to the post by the T5A-B, which is also G7E variant. So that combination of very good range, exceptionally good top speed, and decent warhead nets it a score of 7.7 out of 10, and therefore the podium position, although it's interesting to note the Type 97 is at 7.6 out of 10 and the ET80 at 7.5, so it's a very close run thing. The British Mark 11 is at 6.5, the T2 early version is at 6.3, and the US Mark 18 is at 6.2, so again a very close pack in 4th through 6th, and then everyone else drops off quite badly. And then the second most numerous category is our lightweight torpedoes, which are mostly air-dropped, although some of them can also be launched from submarines, and of course we have our separate little surface category. And this entry is quite considerable. We have 20 torpedoes in our main category, and then those other 4, obviously the only large one is the 21-inch category. And thanks to the fact that almost all nations involved have multiple torpedoes in this category, you'll find that actually the nations that podium finish, that have the top 3 air-launched torpedoes, also actually have entries in the bottom 6 category. And in one case, it's actually 2 different models of the same torpedo. So just picking over some highlights this time, the absolute worst air-dropped torpedo of the war is the German F5. Now, oddly enough, the F5 is a relatively speaking modern entry into the category, being introduced into service in 1939, which is somewhat embarrassing when it's therefore outdone in categorization by some torpedoes that were developed considerably earlier, and of course also at the same time as it. But honestly, anyone who knows anything about air-dropped torpedoes of the Second World War wasn't going to be exactly surprised to see that coming. It's got a fairly pathetic charge, 441 pounds, 485 pound TNT equivalent, so it's not going to be troubling the torpedo defences of anything with substantial torpedo defences, or even a bunch of perhaps the World War I ships with refitted bulges. It's also one of, although not the slowest, at 33 knots, and has a very short range, although again not the worst, but near at it at 2,200 yards. It also doesn't have a slow speed setting, but as we said, airdrop torpedoes usually don't. So it only scores 1.9 out of 10. We then have a rash of torpedoes that are all in the 2 range, 2.6, 2.6, 2.8 and 2.8. That's the Japanese Type 91 Mod 1, which is mainly on there for having the tiniest charge in existence at 331 pounds of Type 97 explosive, so only about 355 pound TNT equivalent. It's really pathetic, to be perfectly honest. And it's also fairly short range, although it's quite high speed over that range. It's just going to sort of ding you if it hits you, and that's about it. Then a couple of British air-dropped torpedoes. They're actually relatively swift, and weirdly enough, there were some of the few that have a slow and fast speed settings. And if you consider their slow speed and range, for example, the Mark 12 has a 37 knot slow speed and a 3,500 yard range. If you slotted that into the upper echelons, that would actually still be 4 knots faster and considerably longer range than the F5, but its high speed setting is what it's been counted on because that's the fairest one across the board. At 40 knots, decent speed, but 1,500 yards at that speed. Not particularly brilliant, and again, not a particularly large warhead, just 440 pounds of TNT. You've also got the F5B Light, which again is not much to write home about. Compared to the F5, its main advantage is that it is considerably faster at 40 knots, but actually carries a smaller charge to make up for that, so unsurprisingly also in the bottom tier. And then scoring 3 out of 10, we have the early models of the US Mark 13, and reliability issues aside, its 404 pounds of TNT is not a particularly impressive warhead. It does have a very impressive range, 5,700 yards, the longest range of any airdrop torpedo in the category, but it only does that at 30 knots, which means that actually quite a lot of its faster targets can just outrun it. France, of course, didn't really get much of an opportunity to innovate and bring in its latest torpedo design, so unsurprisingly its 26V and various derivations thereof, which are mid-1920s airdrop torpedo, are next on the list. Perhaps the main thing that's surprising is the fact that it, at 3.2, is actually scoring considerably better with a 1926 era torpedo, albeit somewhat modified during the 30s, than some of these other torpedoes like the F5B, which was introduced in 1941, if you can believe it. Then we have another model of the Type 91, the Mod 2, then several Italian torpedoes, the F200 5.46 and the SI200 5.36, then the German F5B Heavy torpedo, which is mainly bumped up the list by the fact it now actually has a somewhat scary warhead, just over 600 pounds TNT equivalent, so it could start troubling some of the more modern ships out there. It's also one of the rarer ones with a high-speed and low-speed setting. Still got 2,200 yards high-speed range, which isn't particularly brilliant, but it's got up to 40 knots for that high-speed run, and it's actually got quite an impressive 6,500 yard plus slow-speed setting, albeit at the pedestrian rate of 24 knots. Even a Queen Elizabeth could outrun that thing. And it's kind of a mid-tier torpedo, although we're starting to enter the higher-end categories. We've then got various versions of the Soviet 45-36 torpedo, two more variants of the Japanese Type 91 because they kept modifying it, the Mod 3 and the Mod 3I, and then we enter our top 5. So in number 5 position, we have the British Mark 15 torpedo, which is a mid-war torpedo, which, thanks to the introduction of Torpex, carries one of the heavier TNT equivalent warheads at just under 820 pounds of TNT, so able to breach, at least on paper, almost any torpedo defense system out there. It also has a high speed and low speed setting, and its high speed setting is 40 knots at 2,500 yards, so a little bit better in range than a lot of our lower entries. Not that much to write home about though, but that 40 knot top speed is pretty decent. It's mainly that big warhead though that's giving it that 5th position place. Then we have the Type 91 Mod 4, which has a fairly large warhead again, 679 pounds, so heavier by weight than the British Mark 15, but actually less in TNT equivalent, thanks to being Type 97 explosive, netting it a TNT equivalent charge of just over 720 pounds, but it's very swift through the water at 42 knots, which is the second highest top speed of an airdrop torpedo, but only at 1,640 yards range, which is the second lowest range. But that combination of a high top speed and a fairly large warhead have netted it 4th place. Then in 3rd place, we have the Mod 10 version of the Mark 13 torpedo. So that's the American torpedo. Again, a mid-war introduction here. And that's because it has the second highest warhead in TNT equivalent. It's only a 606 pound warhead. I say only, that's still quite a lot. But thanks to Torpex, that's a 909 pound TNT equivalent warhead, which is a lot of boom. So that's breaching almost any torpedo defense system. It's a relatively pedestrian 33.5 knots, but it can go 4,000 yards, which, if you'll remember, combined with various improvements that the US made for being able to actually drop the thing from a long distance, means that it scores 3rd place with a score of 5.4 out of 10, 0.2 points above the earlier Japanese one and 0.3 points above the British Mark 15. Now, of course, this is where subjective evaluation could bump it up higher, because, as we said, we are comparing just the torpedoes at this point. Much like when we compared main battery guns, we compared the guns, not the turret systems that they were in, because obviously guns can be mounted in lots of different turret systems. And so you could now, at this point, be making an argument that with the combination of that high and high speed drop that the Avengers could do in the late war, perhaps that would improve the Mark 15's chances and put it at the top of the podium, but it's still in 3rd place at this point. So, if you want to see that, perhaps come up with an objective way of scoring the delivery systems. But then, of course, we're now into more scoring aircraft at that point, which I'm not so capable of doing. In any case, a very late entry into the war, but just about in use. The 2nd place goes to the British Mark 17 torpedo, which has a near equivalent warhead to the late model Mark 13. 6 pounds less, but it's Torpex, so at 900 pound TNT equivalent. Again, very powerful, somewhat faster than the Mark 13 at 40 knots, but only over a 2,500 yard range. So under conventional torpedo drop conditions, that's not necessarily a problem, but could be a problem later on unless you want to adopt the US approach to torpedo drops. And then at the absolute pinnacle of everything is yet another version of the Japanese Type 91, this time the Mod 7, because it has one of the highest top speeds. In fact, only the French torpedo has a higher top speed. It's 42 knots through the water. It's got the heaviest warhead by far. It carries 926 pounds of Type 97 explosive, so 990 pounds of TNT equivalent, which is just about capable of defeating any torpedo defense system in the Second World War. So we've got near enough, we have the biggest, in fact, torpedo warhead, a top entry, although not quite the top entry for speed, and that's what's putting it in the podium position. But of course, as I said, 640-yard top maximum range. Well, to be fair, that is within the drop range of most torpedo bombers at the time, but it is considerably less than the British and American entries in this top 5. So you may want to take that into consideration, especially since it's only introduced in 1944, and therefore if you were, as with the Mark 13, going to add in the efficiency of, if not necessarily the delivery system, i.e. the aircraft, but the drop system, i.e. the distance and the speed it can be dropped, that could hold it back if that scoring category was also added in. And then very briefly, we have the 4 entries for surface-launched 18-inch torpedoes. And in this case, there's actually only 2 nations competing, the Soviets and the Italians. At the number 4 position, we have the Soviet 45-36N, which has the lowest speed, actually, of all of them at 41 knots, and a mid-tier range, 3,280 yards for the surface-launched 18-inch torpedoes, and a fairly small warhead, but one that pretty much everybody shares in this category at about 440 pounds of TNT. Slightly higher on the pecking order is the Italian SI 200 5.36, which has same warhead size, a slightly less range at 2,200 yards, but it gets there 3 knots faster at 44 knots, which is just enough to give it, well, the Soviet one gets 0.8 out of 10, this one gets 1.1 out of 10. Then we have the Italian W200 5.25, again, exactly the same warhead size, but is now 2 knots faster still at 46 knots, and can go 4,400 yards. So it's the longest range and highest speed of all the surface-launched 18-inch torpedoes, and it's only really let down by that relatively small warhead. And then the Soviet 46-36NU torpedo takes the top spot. It's got the joint lowest speed and range, 41 knots, 3,280 yards, with the 45-36N that was at the bottom, but it's the only one with a bigger warhead than 440 pounds at just over 620 pounds of TNT, and so might actually trouble something with a half-decent torpedo defense system, which was enough to push it to the top of the category. And then we are now on to our biggest category, which is the 21-inch torpedo, which is the most common surface and sub-launched type of torpedo that you'll find in the Second World War. This has no less than 34 entries, and so somewhat similar to the air-launched torpedoes, we're going to look at the bottom 5, quickly speed run through everything that sits in the middle, and then look at the top 5. So the bottom 5 places, we actually have 2 entries from the US, 2 from Italy, and 1 from the UK. Now, the bottom 2 entries are perhaps unsurprising, the US Mark 9 and Mark 10 torpedoes, because they're also World War I vintage torpedoes, and pretty much the only reason they're on this list is because, well, the US was actually using them in some of its older submarines, certainly at the start of their involvement in World War II. But their geriatric era design means that, unsurprisingly, they have very small torpedo warheads for a 21-inch torpedo, 395 pounds and 485 pounds respectively, although the World War II era Mark 9s and Mark 10s were known to have Torpex warheads installed, which does push their TNT equivalent charge up considerably, but they, unlike almost every torpedo in this category, don't have a slow speed setting, which marks them down, and their top speed isn't really much to write home about either, 34.5 and 36 knots respectively. That's pretty much, well, the lowest and second lowest entries, and their range is also quite bad. 5,500 yards for the Mark 9, which is the slower of the two, and just 3,500 yards, although there is one that's slightly worse than that further on, for the Mark 10. Now, again, with these longer distances, you might argue, especially in a sub-launched torpedo, which these are, that perhaps it doesn't matter so much because most submarines didn't really launch torpedo attacks on targets from outside of maybe 1,000, 1,500 yards, but some of them were launched beyond that, and of course your range to target versus your range the torpedo travels can be different, because you might be, let's say, 1,000 yards from your target, but if your target is moving, then your torpedo might have to go considerably further than 1,000 yards, at which point, especially a 3,500 yard range might begin to be a bit problematic. But anyway, that's why they're at the bottom. Then we have the Italian SI-270I torpedo, which has, for this entry category at 595 pounds of TNT, a pretty small warhead. It does have a slow and fast speed setting, but the range is joint bottom at 3,300 yards, although it gets there at 42 knots, and it's also got a not particularly impressive slow speed setting, tootling along at just 26 knots. Just above it is the Italian W270F torpedo, which has a fractionally smaller warhead, but is just a little bit faster on its slow speed setting and a knot faster on its high speed setting, so just edging out its compatriot there. And then the top of the bottom, as it were, is the British Mark 7 torpedo, a surface launch weapon introduced in the mid-1920s, so perhaps unsurprising why it's all the way down here. It has quite the chunky 740-pound warhead, which, given everything else we've heard about so far, for the most part sounds pretty impressive, although it's only about mid-range for these torpedoes, the 21 inches. But it's only going at 35 knots, and it's going 5,700 yards, so not particularly quick and not particularly far for this set of entries. So that's your bottom five. And then we've got the Soviet 5327, then the US Mark 8, another old torpedo from World War I, the early model of the US Mark 14, which mainly is down in this area because of its 507-pound TNT warhead, which isn't particularly brilliant. I mean, the other statistics also aren't fantastic. It's got a decent fast speed, but not a particularly brilliant range. Then early models of the British Mark 8 torpedo, which is a 1927 vintage weapon. The Soviet 53-36, the first models of US Mark 15, so the Mod 0, so that's their main destroyer-launched torpedo of the Second World War. Then the French 24V and 24M, they're again mid-1920s torpedoes. The fact that in both the 18-inch airdropped category and this 21-inch sub and surface launch category, the French mid-20s torpedoes are, okay, they're not top podium or even in the top half, but they're maybe the top of the bottom third, makes it quite interesting to see what could have happened if the French had introduced modern torpedoes during the war, but of course they were knocked out early on. In any case, we then get the Soviet 5338 model, the Italian SI-270M, the US Mark 11, the US Mark 12, the British Mark 10 Star, the Italian W256.5, another Italian, the W270 Veloce, the Italian W256.72, then the American Mark 14 Mod 3, the Japanese Type 89, the German G7A T1, the Soviet 53-38U, then the British Mark 9 torpedo, and now we're starting to get up towards the higher end of things, the Soviet 5337, the UK Mark 9 Star, the French 23D-23DT, which just edges out on a top 6 position. It's in 7th, even though it's a 1925 era torpedo. It's not got the world's most impressive warhead at 683 pounds of TNT, but it can go a surprisingly long 14,200 yards at 35 knots on its slow speed setting, and a creditable 9,840 yards at 39 knots at its higher speed setting. 39 knots at fast speed is not really all that much to write home about, but that's a fairly long distance for it to go. And then we're into our top 6. At the 6th place position is the US Mark 15 Mod 3, so the more advanced version of its surface-launched torpedo. Now, that mainly gets in because of a truly ridiculous warhead size, and you'll notice all of the subsequent torpedoes have very, very large warheads. In this case, it's because it's 823 pounds of Torpex, so just over 1,200 pounds TNT equivalent, which is one heck of a boom. If it hits you. Now, to be fair, it's got a fairly high surface running speed of 45 knots at fast setting, but its range is actually pretty bad at 4,500 yards. It's one of the lowest ranges, which is why it's just out of top 5. So, our top 5 positions for surface and sub-launch torpedoes are taken by, surprisingly, because the Germans are way, way back, in 5th place, the British Mark 8 Star, which is essentially almost the same torpedo as the one that would take out the Belgrano in 1982. Compared to earlier iterations of the Mark 8, it's now rocking a Torpex warhead, which gives it just over 1,200 pounds of TNT equivalent, because on an 805 pound base charge. Its slow speed setting is 41 knots, which is the second highest speed for the slow speed setting of any torpedo in this category, although it only goes about 7,000 yards doing so, and it has a high speed setting of 45.5 knots going 5,000 yards. So again, not going particularly far, but doing it at a fair old clip. And this is, as I said, a sub-launched weapon. Above that is the British Mark 9 Double Star, so this is in 4th place, again introduced during the war with a Torpex warhead exactly the same size as the Mark 8s. It has a slower speed setting, or a slower speed setting I should say, only going at 35 knots, which isn't particularly much to write home about. It's mid-tier for its slow speed, but it goes 15,000 yards, which is quite good. And perhaps more surprisingly, it can go 11,000 yards at 41 knots, which is its high speed setting. So its high speed, top speed, again, is mid-tier, but it has the longest range capability of all of these 21-inch torpedoes, which is why it's earned itself its number 4 spot. The top 3 is a full podium occupation by the Japanese. Perhaps unsurprisingly, you probably saw that one coming. The first entry, or number 3 entry, is the Type 96 torpedo, and this is on the podium partially because of its absolutely ridiculous warhead. It's got a 1,213 pound warhead base, which makes it the joint largest torpedo charge by, just by sheer weight of explosive. And with a Type 97 explosive in there, that means it's just shy of 1,300 pounds of TNT equivalent. So that means everything in the top 6 is going to blow through any torpedo defense that you have. It, interestingly enough, is a very rare example of a 21-inch torpedo that doesn't seem to have a slow speed setting. It just has an insanely fast setting of 49 knots at 4,900 yards. So not a particularly long range submarine launch torpedo, but more than capable of crossing almost all submarine engagement distances and going at an absolute clip while it's doing so. It also uses oxygen as opposed to compressed air. Second place is the Type 95 Mod 2, a late war introduction by the Japanese, which interestingly enough is pipped to the podium post, the top post, in first place by its immediate predecessor, the Type 95 Mod 1, which is 6 years older. Now, you might think that's a bit odd, and when you initially look at the warhead sizes, you're even more odd, because the Mod 2 carries the same 1,213 pound warhead as the Type 96, which is just short of 1,300 pounds TNT equivalent, whereas the Mod 1 is a mere 893 pounds or 955 pounds of TNT equivalent. And they both have the same speed setting for low speed, which is 46 knots. But because of that extra explosive weight, the Type 95 Mod 1 is considerably longer range than the more heavily explosively laden Mod 2, capable of going 13,100 yards compared to the 8,200 yards of the Mod 2, and they're both capable of 50 knots or potentially more at top speed. But again, thanks to carrying a slightly smaller warhead, the Mod 1 can go almost 10,000 yards, the Mod 2 can only go 6,000 yards. So from a purely objective perspective, well, 955 pound TNT equivalent is still going to blow through practically anything it comes across, but the Mod 1 can go considerably further. Of course, the Mod 2 is going to do more damage, but both being sub-launched torpedoes, there's a potential for very long-range shots not getting there. And that wraps up all of the torpedo comparisons, although you might already be furiously typing at your keyboards, as we said earlier with these sub-launched torpedoes, that, well, does it really make a difference? 6,000 versus almost 10,000 yard launch range? How many World War II submarines actually launched attacks at 4, 5, 6,000 yards for this to actually make any kind of difference? But as I said at the beginning of the video, this is one of the issues with looking at a purely technical analysis of which torpedo can go the furthest, the fastest, carries the most explosives, etc., etc. It's entirely possible to argue, and indeed, obviously, because the Japanese introduced it as a Mod 2, they presumably did believe that the Mod 2 was superior, being happy to sacrifice the range at the top end for just hitting with considerably more boom. But as I said at the beginning, if you'd like to suggest modifiers and additional things that could be added in that can be measured objectively, or perhaps you think less weighting should be given to range or something like that, again, chime in below. As I said, the data sheets are available on the website, dragonfall.co.uk, link in the video description below, so you can play around with them if you want and come up with your own rating systems. I'll be very interested to see them. But, well, there you go.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.